Hi, this is Paul. Kurt Jamungal just recently had a very substantive conversation with John Vervaeke, and the substantive conversation actually impacts a whole bunch of things. And in this video, I'm going to connect it with the categories of sincerity and authenticity, these two cultural modes that in some ways have been going back and forth through many of our culture war aspects, including I've applied it quite a bit to the Christian Reformed Church's current struggle. You can see that in this slide. Gloria, sort of team authenticity. What's wrong with wearing a swimsuit in the living room? Archie, team sincerity. Swimsuits are for the beach. Dresses are for the living room. That's the way, that's the mode you should be in the space you are in. And I've been talking about this with respect to the Christian Reformed Church. A lot of people have been using this in our Sunday morning estuary. A lot of people hear this, and right now in this current mode with, let's say, all this squaring off between conservatives and progressives or liberals, a lot of people want to say, well, team sincerity is conservative and team authenticity is liberal or progressive. And certainly there is some mapping to that. But there's also a way in which there's definitely a dynamic of opponent processing going on between sincerity and authenticity. And I'm going to get into that too. And I'm also going to get into this video I made, start to dig into my conversation with Roy Clouser, who has brought together, I mean, it's sort of the shtick when he says Calvin, Luther, and the Orthodox are sort of set up against most of Protestantism and Catholicism with respect to God. And it's like, oh, what's with this? And there's a lot of skepticism. That video got quite a bit more traction, I assume by virtue of the thumbnail and the title, than I would have anticipated. But I very much want to connect that to what John is talking about when John talks about a critique of substance ontology. And what's been interesting about John is that in some ways I've commented to others that John has been moving. Maybe John would disagree with this, and so I'm going to talk to him in June. John's project has very much been a project of exploration and journey. Now, it's on a Silk Road, so of course there's journey. But it's very interesting watching and continuing to listen to him talk about a number of these things and watch how they sort of manifest in his life. And it really gets going here on the sacred. Now, I realize that for a lot of people, this is tough sledding. A lot of the stuff in this conversation is very philosophical, very abstract. But I want to, in this video, be able to show you in some ways how some of this meets the road and how it really, in a lot of ways, connects with this conversation, this ongoing, let's say it's beyond modernity. I wouldn't want to call it meta-modern. Again, that word's very up for grabs right now in this little corner, but very much connected with this tension between a culture of sincerity and a culture of authenticity. So let's start with John and Kurt.
This phrase that you've said, which is the advent of the sacred.
Yes.
In other words, the sacred is coming back.
Yes. Okay? Yeah.
That implies the sacred has gone.
Okay, now, of course, and this is part of where we're going to get into relationality here, because, see, I don't even like using the word theist, because, again, if you do a little bit of Googling on the word theist, you see how new a term is. So much of this conversation is very, very new. And when I say very, very new, I mean measured in centuries rather than millennia. So I know right away, religious people, it's even that term, people who go to church or synagogue or mosque or some other thing that they would, even in our culture, identify as religious, they would say the sacred hasn't gone anywhere. It's our attention to the sacred that has varied. Okay, don't worry about that. Continue to follow along.
So where did the sacred go, and what is the sacred?
Well, maybe I'll answer the second question first because it'll make it easier to explain where it went if we know what we're talking about. Um, so I've been very influenced by the Canadian philosopher, and I'll promote Canadians as much as I can, Schellenberg, and very famous philosopher in these circles. He's responsible for creating one of the new atheist arguments, the hiddenness argument, and developing it. But he's not your typical atheist by any means, and he wants to get at a notion of the sacred that I think works because it's open enough for his project, which he calls the evolution of religion. His central thesis is that we are actually, it's very plausible that we're very spiritually immature and our grasp on ultimate reality is very tenuous, and that we should not be making strong pronouncements about ultimate reality. But
Now, there's a lot in there. Okay, what on earth are strong pronouncements? Now, he's going to go into thick and thin and a bunch of things here pretty soon. And again, that's sort of rough sledding, but I want to get at, he's going to get into the question of what is God. He's going to get into the question of a view from nowhere, a bunch of these important themes. Now, I haven't watched his conversation with Evan Thompson. I actually had a conversation this morning, not because when Strawn and I, some of you will recognize his name, some of you won't know who he is. Old BOM people, John will know him. Yeah, I've been talking with Strawn a little bit more lately. It's always offline when we talk, but he mentioned the Evan Thompson conversation, so that one is very much has to be on my radar too.
he thinks that the proposal that there is an ultimate reality is it's worth pursuing. And so the notion of the sacred develops from that. The sacred is what he calls the triple transcendent, and I like this definition. The sacred is what is ultimately real. So that's the first transcendent. It's transcendently real in some fashion. Other things.
Okay, now there's a ton in there. Now this other question, this move, when clergy and pastors will talk about God, of course, that tiny little three-letter word, there's so much shoehorned in there. A lot of it ambiguous in terms of how people are talking and what people are saying. And now with sort of this new rush into interest about God and belief in God, even Jordan Peterson on Pints with Aquinas saying, oh yeah, Joe Rogan too. Here we all, back into this rush with God. So Clouser, of course, in this other Clouser short video, I did 2 short videos that are clips of the whole video. They're all out on the channel now. But in the short video, talking about Clouser's sort of idea that divinity is this source. And so even though it's sort of postured in a different way from what John is, both Roy Clouser and John Vervaeke are in some ways trying to get at similar things. Now, John Vervaeke much more somewhat in an exploratory mode. Roy Clouser now into his 80s, feeling himself much more in a declarational mode. But these two things are very much coming together.
Things are real in terms of it rather than vice versa. It's ultimately transformative. It affords the most powerful transformations that human beings can undergo. And it's ultimately valuable. It provides the ultimate kind of normative guidance for people.
Okay, so later on he's going to talk about real is in some way a comparative word similar to tall. Tall is always in relation to something, and this John's going to sort of lean into this relationality. And he just had 3. Okay, what is the sacred? Now you'll notice again, okay, we're going to use the word the sacred, transcendent, divinity. In this world that has been impacted by hyperpluralism, there's sort of a search out there for words that can sort of be maximally inoffensive and relatable for people across the divides of philosophy and the traditional world religions. So back to these 3 points.
Influenced by the Canadian philosopher, very famous atheist arguments, the atheist sacred, that I think works because it's open enough for his project, which he calls the evolution of religion. His central thesis is that we are actually, it's very plausible that we're very spiritually immature and our grasp on ultimate reality is very tenuous, and that...
Then the interesting thing about that is, even though people who don't act in a way that the West calls religious, that there's conflict between the religious and non-religious on how immature we are. Most religious traditions will assert to its own believers that we are in fact extremely immature, that God is beyond us, etc., etc. We'll say things like we are sinners, all in need of grace, all of those things. So that ostensibly is not a controversial position for religious people. And of course, sort of with the rise and fall of the Church of New Atheism, increasingly new atheists are backing out of atheism and into some kind of civilizational Christianity, let's say.
We should not be making strong pronouncements about ultimate reality. But...
And I'd love to know what an example of that might be.
He thinks that the proposal that there is an ultimate reality...
Okay, so there is an ultimate reality, and again, you can throw in the simulation question, and are we living in ultimate reality? And again, reality is sort of a comparative word. Something is more real than another. Something is taller than another. And he uses that example a little bit later, and I think that's quite helpful.
It's worth pursuing. And so
that, again, it's worth pursuing. And again, back to Clouser's assertion that, well, divinity is that source from which everything comes. And then the religious have figured out that, well, knowledge of this source, relationship with this source is actually very important for what? For the true, the good, and the beautiful. You could say it that way. You could say it different ways.
The notion of the sacred develops from that. The sacred is what he calls the triple transcendent, and I like this definition.
Okay, the triple transcendent, so there'll be 3.
The sacred is what is ultimately real, so that's the first transcendent.
Okay,
it's transcendently real in some fashion.
Okay, what is ultimate really real? So it's sort of a tautology of what he said. There is a really real, and we're going to use this word for it.
Other things are real in terms of it, rather than vice versa.
So this comparative is either you're getting closer to it, so that's realer, more real, or further away from it. So that then becomes the thing in relation to which there is reality. A lot of use of the word real here.
It's ultimately transformative. It affords the most powerful transformations.
Okay, so change in human beings, transformations happen with respect to this. And again, if you're sort of listening to this and all this abstract philosophical verbiage, but if you're sort of understanding it, you're saying, God is the source. In him we live and move and have our being. If we're closer to God, we're increasingly transformed in his likeness. That's all sort of Christian ways of verbalizing what John is sort of talking about in the abstract. And again, we go to this abstraction because of globalization, pluralism, and so we're looking for language that a Christian would say okay, and the various different traditions would say okay, and in other words, okay, we're not scared off by the hypothetical language. We might not say it's the best, because we think our language is more particular and therefore more precise. But anyway, for the sake of conversing with people not within our tradition, we'll find out where we'll compare notes and see where we can agree.
That human beings can undergo. And it's ultimately valuable. It provides the ultimate kind of normative guidance for people.
Okay, and so again, nothing, even though, again, for many people, especially people who are used to talking about these things in your own specific religious language, he's basically saying, the sacred, sort of like God, and we're going to talk about God a little bit more, and it's the source of all things. And to be in alignment with God, to be in participation with God, these are good things. These things transform us, and this is the way to go. It's basically what he's saying. You could sort of translate that into Christianese.
And that often shades into that people don't just have sort of a cold cognitive relationship to it. The relationship is more, they love this reality in some important way.
And again, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So again, there's nothing anywhere problematic about that in terms of a Christian can listen to that, sort of translate it into Christianese and say, oh yeah, that's just sort of basic. And again, it's not entirely, even though different major world religions might translate it in slightly different ways, sort of like Roy Clouser is doing, it's kind of a piece. Nothing particular there.
I think that's important because when you mention that to many people who are not religious, they consider that a proposal worth investigating, because you can investigate each one of those to a certain degree philosophically and empirically.
So now the hope is, okay, because people have either are post-religious or have rejected religion, and so, okay, I don't want any of that. Okay, God is the source of everything. Well, I don't believe that. God is participating with God or being in relationship with God is transformative. Well, I'm skeptical about that. God, in fact, if we move closer to God, things will be better. Well, I don't know about that. But, well, there's this thing called the sacred or divinity or the source, or I've heard it phrased many different ways. And Wayne Dyer, of course, is out there. And you can find how many videos about Wayne Dyer talking about the source. And the source has sort of been used in various New Age circles. And what you should do is get closer to the source and be more like the source. And okay, so secular people are going to hear that and think, okay, that sounds okay. And they might think that, well, natural foods are better than synthetic foods for that reason, because it's closer to the source and our source's nature. Again, this is very much in keeping with
this approach deserves to be called Christian for this reason.
Whoops, wrong video. The other video.
State was really taken to mean the separation of politics and religion.
Right.
And of course, that's a huge mistake if I'm right about the definition of religious belief. And I've had a lot of years to think about this now, and I've seen a lot of objections, and I don't think they amount to anything. This seems to...
Now, it's helpful to note that Roy has had a career teaching comparative religion. So it's not that he is unfamiliar with the other major world religions. And from that he gets his ideas about divinity.
And generate tradition that is. And my argument here, and Professor Doywords as well, and some other people, is that not only is that the central issue in a religious tradition, that is identifying the divine reality. Is the divine reality God? Is it Brahmanatma? Is it, for an ancient Egyptian, Amun-Ra? There are dozens and dozens of, let's say, candidates for divinity, but they all regard whatever goes properly into that role as being self-existent and generating everything else. In fact, this comes out of Calvin. Calvin says, whatever.
Okay. So, and then if you get a little further, he'll define the religious. The link for that will be below, along with the whole thing. So again, nothing controversial here yet.
But traditional religious people also like the definition. And then what I do with that is I sort of plug in some of the machinery of the theoretical machinery I do about relevance, realization, and meaning in life, and belongingness and connectedness, and say what sacredness is an experience of very significant, pronounced meaning, because one senses, believes. Believe isn't quite the right word. One senses that one is in deep connection to something that's ultimately real. One is being afforded a really pivotal transformation, and that connection to the really real is really helping orient people and giving them sort of a North Star by which they can make more specific normative judgments about what's good, true, and beautiful.
Again, as John said, well, he's using sacred instead of divinity, but he and Clouser are very much working on exactly the same project.
You said the traditional people like this idea of the sacred.
Yeah.
And you plug into this an idea on relevance realization. So there are 3 pillars, and then you add a fourth,
Yep.
or a fourth with asterisks because there's some nuance
Yeah,
to
yeah.
it. Okay, what do the traditionally religious people add to it? So they agree with 3. What do they add?
Well, of course, we're talking. Let's be clear that we're talking about sort of the Abrahamic tradition, because of course, the idea of the sacred is probably a universal, which means there's something important there. So I think Schellenberg is actually helpful here too. He talks about the nature of your conception and the strength of ultimacy. So you can have and he gets this notion, although I don't think he ever cites Geertz, and I should write him a letter about this, a thick description. This is where you have a lot of features that are well developed about your conception of what the sacred is, and you can really give a lot of specific characteristics, etc. Versus a thin description, which is a lot, usually generally more abstract, less specific, even in that sense, vaguer, right? So that's you can have a thick or a thin description.
And so that's sort of a really nice way of, well, religious people have a very thick description. They have a long tradition. They have a rich history. They've got all kinds of narrative, all kinds of language. It's embedded in, hundreds of pages of stories and all of this. And the secular, it's just sort of thin. You use those abstract words, but in principle, you'll say, yeah, that sounds right.
And then you can have, how strong is your sense of transcendence? If you're very strong, you have the triple transcendent. As you remove these, you get a weaker transcendent.
Sorry, wait. If you have all 3, you have a strong transcendence?
Yes. And as you remove them, you get weaker. So
okay.
He argues that the best alternative is a thin description of a strong transcendence. This is different from traditional theism that is...
Okay, so remember, the 3 things are that there is a source, basically that the source is... being near the source is transformative, and it's transformative for the better. And so he's going to argue as a secular philosopher, because that's very much what he's describing, is saying he's making the strong 3 points and saying, but it's going to be thin. So maybe if it's thin, we can spread it over all the toast of the world religions. You're going to spread that thing on thin so that it covers all of the toast. And of course, part of the question then will be, and this has been the long-standing question with respect to philosophical projects versus, let's say, religious traditions, is that the thickness is obviously, in some ways, it can be encumbering in terms of, well, particularities change, and how well do the traditions transform to new contexts and all that, and how well do they deal with pluralism. But at the same time, somebody who is in them is deeply embedded. And so they're living in a rich atmosphere. And you might even say that, so both of those are going to, the thinness is just sort of we're gonna have the particulars, but it's sort of like having a wife you don't live with. Are you married? Yes, I have a wife. Well, my wife is the source of my marriage. My wife has potential for great transformation in me, and it's all for the good. But do you live with her? Not really. I barely talk to her. Well, why not? Well, because she doesn't like me playing computer games all day, and so I play computer games, and now that might be a little unfair, and I don't mean to be unfair, but if you're living with a wife, things get thick fast with all of the particularities. And if, let's say, something happens to wife number one and you move on to wife number two, well, there's a lot of the thickness of wife number one is going to be an encumbrance in terms of wife number two in the relationship, especially if wife number one is still alive. But anyway.
A strong, that is a thick description of a strong transcendence. And then I would plug into where I think there are problems in that thick description. A lot of it, this is not universally the case, but a lot of the way in which traditional theism is taken up into sort of modern current Christianity, especially Protestant North American Christianity, although I think you can make a similar argument for Catholicism with Aquinas, is the idea of God as an Aristotelian substance. God is an existing individual thing to which properties belong, and God is the owner and the author of properties and actions. So it's a substance metaphysics, and it plugs into the idea that we get at reality with sort of the implicit logic within language, a subject-predicate logic. So
okay, now what he said before we get too far.
Actually, Protestant North American Christianity, although I think you can make a similar argument for Catholicism with Aquinas, is the idea of God as an Aristotelian substance. God is an existing individual thing to which properties belong, and God is the owner and the author of properties and actions. So it's a substance metaphysics, and it plugs into the idea that we get at reality with sort of the implicit logic within language.
Now, he's then going to talk about relationality, and they're going to talk a lot about relationality, and the video is out there, and you can watch it. But what's interesting is how much that tracks with Roy's assertion about belief in God in the West.
I think this approach deserves to be called Christian for this reason, that the doctrine of the Incarnation is the only thing that makes the belief in a transcendent creator one that we can actually discuss or...
Okay, I'm going to hold off on this part until we get a little bit later into John Vervaeke. Let me find the place I want.
I think this approach deserves to be called Christian for this reason, that the doctrine of the Incarnation is the only thing that makes the belief in a transcendent creator one that we can actually discuss or speak about. How do our terms apply to God? All our terms are drawn from creatures, from creation. If we call God Father, call God the Judge. God says in Scripture, don't get thinking that the things you use now you own permanently or have some absolute right to. The world's mine, not yours. Okay? We can go on and on and on. How can our terms apply to one who transcends all that, who called all that into existence? How can that be true of him? And the Incarnation, that doctrine rejected by both Jew and Muslim, is the only answer that makes any sense. It is that God takes created things into himself. That's what he did in the Incarnation. He took the whole person of Jesus Christ into himself so that Christ is the human side of God and God is the divine side of Christ. That very idea of taking things that God himself has generated that depend on him into himself so that they are true of himself is how all the other terms got to be true of God as well. They walked and talked with Adam. He said, don't do this. He said, I got angry with this, and you're out of the garden for that. All that can be absolutely true because God takes the created characteristics he has generated into himself and forms the nature this is what Calvin said, the nature in which he is pleased to manifest himself. Now, the whole tradition of theology, from Augustine, from Anselm, and refined in Aquinas, denies that and instead identifies God with all and only Plato's perfections.
Hmm.
God is the being with all and only perfections.
Yeah.
Of course, he has perfect existence also. So he's self-existent, doesn't depend on anything. But what's the very nature of God is something he can't help. He doesn't have those perfections. He is them. God is the unity of all the perfections. And that theology dominates not only Catholic tradition in theology, but Protestantism as a movement has never left it. As a movement, Protestantism never followed Luther and Calvin on their doctrine of God. Reform the church, get rid of the Pope's authority. Yay, yay, yes, we'll follow that. Good stuff. But the doctrine of God, nah. Aquinas and Augustine got that right. And I think that the day that Augustine did that, it's in, I think it's book 3 of the City of God, the Platonists got it right. They saw that there were perfections and that there's a chief perfection Plato calls the Godfather of all things.
Hmm.
See, their mistake was in thinking that there are multiple, or maybe an infinite number, of perfections and the supreme one. We know that that's all in one being, the God of the Bible. Now, where does Scripture say God has all and only perfections? Where does it even say God has a perfection?
Yeah,
Nowhere.
no, that language is definitely alien from Scripture.
See, I love the way St. Basil, now the Eastern Church never bought this. They rejected it before Augustine wrote it. And St. Basil said in one place, if there are perfections, God created them. They don't constitute God. God, they're creations. I think, by the way, that there are no such things, and I offer an argument for that at the end of this book. There are no such things as perfections as Plato defined them. So it's not demeaning to say of God that he doesn't have them. The only time the word perfect occurs in the New Testament that I know of is where Jesus says to his disciples, you be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, if that meant Platonic perfections, he'd be telling them to be God.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make any sense at all.
So your assertion is that Calvin gets this right, the East gets this right, but Augustine and Anselm and many who then many others got it wrong. So my question would be, where did Calvin get it from? Why did Calvin get this right? Especially because he follows Augustine so closely on so many other things.
Okay. Both Luther and Calvin quote Augustine a lot to support points. There's a reason for that. The Middle Ages was a time when quoting an ancient source settled a debate.
Right.
If you could find any ancient thinker that says what you're saying, you must be right. And Augustine became that kind of an authority in the Christian tradition. I think the guy made mistakes that are important, but his authority has been so great, no one's, or few people are willing to consider that he got something wrong. But Luther and Calvin found that he backed a lot of what they wanted to call for, so they quoted him often. Now, where did Calvin get this idea that agrees with the Eastern Orthodox? By the way, I'm going to add, the Eastern Orthodox recognize this about Calvin. There have been articles published about how Calvin's theology of God is the same as the Orthodox and blah, blah. And one of the great patriarchs of Constantinople, a man named Cyril Lucaris, made a trip to Geneva just to honor the memory of Calvin. That's sometime in the early 1700s, I think he made that trip. Lucaris' will reads, if I die, and he was being threatened, and he ultimately was assassinated. If I die a Catholic of the Orthodox faith and an admirer of the esteemed John Calvin of Geneva. You can't imagine two traditions more unalike when it comes to the organization of the church and the liturgy and all the rest of that. Orthodoxy has the most elaborate liturgy in Christendom, and Calvin had the minimum, the bare minimum. But But when it came to the doctrine of God, the Orthodox have always recognized that this is so.
Hmm.
And you said, where did Calvin get this? And I tried to find out if he read it in any of the Cappadocian Fathers. This is Basil of Caesarea, Bishop of Caesarea, his brother Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, his brother-in-law, and his sister Macrina. They did a body of work that became the basis for Eastern Orthodox theology, the way Augustine did for the Western Church. Augustine wasn't the first to suggest that God is identical with Plato's forms. Who's the guy who came before him that was ruled a heretic? I was just going to say his name. That's one of the problems of being, we'll just say, over 75. which is playing it down.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned
anyway,
that because
not the first to do this.
CW was like, you got to talk to Roy because and then the way CW described you, I'm thinking, oh, this poor guy, he's just barely hanging on. And I see you in CW, I see you in Christian's channel. It's like, this guy's just fine.
Well, can he tell you how old I am? My literary advisor told me not to let anybody know.
Don't worry about it. I think it's a milestone. It's fine to brag about it if you want to.
No,
but so where do you get this in Calvin?
I tried to find this out. So one of the things I did was go to the Princeton Seminary Library, and I got out a 4-volume work of Calvin's correspondence. Did he ever write a letter to any bishop east of Czechoslovakia? And I read all 4 volumes and never found it. There's no letter. I didn't find it. As far as I have been able to find, there was no contact between him and any bishop in the East. We know he did read some of the Cappadocians because he quotes them and refers to them. That's fine. But whether he got that doctrine of God from them or came on his own, I don't know. But he certainly held the same doctrine. That's very clear, and they admit it too. And they're pretty insular in that way. In the late 1500s, a delegation of Lutherans went to Constantinople and said they recognized this, and they said, "Don't we have the same theology?" They were hoping to get some backing against the Pope. The patriarch took quite a while to answer them, but after a couple of years, he said, "Yes, we are, and you're welcome to rejoin the one true church anytime you want." But that was as far as that got. But again, they recognized that was Luther's doctrine too. So Protestantism kissed off the Reformers' doctrine of God. Whole tradition of theology, from Augustine, from Anselm, and refined in Aquinas, denies that and instead identifies God with all and only Plato's perfections. God is the being with all and only perfections.
Yeah.
Of course, he has perfect existence also. So he's self-existent, doesn't depend on anything. But what's the very nature of God is something he can't help. He doesn't have those perfections. He is them. God is the unity of.
Okay, now he's arguing against this, okay? Because I started a little early, and then I'll drop the whole clip in because it's important. And basically what's interesting here is that in some ways Clouser is inverting this thinness a bit. Because Clouser is saying it's actually only in the thickness that you can participate as human beings with this God. And it is only because of the incarnation that we can be in relationality with this God, because this God can't really be in relationality with us if this God is merely the sum of these thin theoretical perfections.
All the perfections. And that theology dominates not only Catholic tradition in theology, but Protestantism as a movement has never left it. As a movement, Protestantism never followed Luther and Calvin on their doctrine of God. Reform the church, get rid of the Pope's authority. Yay, yay, yes, we'll follow that. Good stuff.
Okay, we're going to thin it down. We're going to thin it down.
But the doctrine of God, nah. Aquinas and Augustine got that right. And I think that the day that Augustine did that, it's in, I think it's book 3 of the City of God, the Platonists got it right. They saw that there were perfections and that there's a chief perfection Plato calls the Godfather of all things. See, their mistake was in thinking that there are multiple, or maybe an infinite number, of perfections and the supreme one. We know that that's all in one being, the God of the Bible.
Now it's helpful, and really this is why I presented Roy with Ezekiel Kaufman's revolutionary monotheism as opposed to this evolutionary monotheism. Because, of course, if you read Augustine in the City of God, he is dealing hard with Roman polytheism. And in a sense, and all of these gods are pointing to the one God. And so, again, this is sort of shaking up the thinness and the thickness. But the question is, well, how can we actually now Clouser is going to say in some ways Augustine, Aquinas had too much Plato and Aristotle, in that whether it's the forms or the unmoved mover, God is inaccessible to us by virtue of he is just bound up in these perfections and cannot be relational to us. Now I'll drop the whole clip in here. I should I'll have to try and remember where this is. But let's go back to Vervaeke.
Subject predicate logic. So you have substance and properties that match onto subject and predicate, and so you get God is therefore. Let me make one more thing clear. Many people, when they hear the word substance, they still hear stuff. But the original idea of substance, the prototypical example for Aristotle of a substance was a person. Because a person is considered to be something that is always the subject and never a predicate. So I can say, John is a man or John is tall, but I can't say, oh, the tree is John, unless I'm speaking metaphorically or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Right? And so what you're looking for things that are not predicates. They're not properties. They're the owners or possessors of properties. And that's what's most real. So God is a super person, a super subject, a super actor, a super thing, a super individual, independently.
And of course, those of you who have listened to my channel for a long time will very quickly recognize God number 1 and God number 2 in this. And God is a super thing in the sky. God is a super person. And but now, pay attention here, because John is pointing to the question of substance with respect to this.
The existing thing. And that's also sort of standard theism. I think that is a very, very problematic notion, because it doesn't sit well with the kind of ontology I think we're moving towards philosophically and scientifically, which is an ontology that is also more accommodating to the kinds of ontology that have been more developed in Asiatic philosophy, especially Zen Buddhism, Taoism. And so what I think a common thread that's emerging is this idea that reality is ultimately relational. What's ultimate about reality is relationality. So it's not that there are things between which relations emerge. There are relations out of which things emerge.
Relations between what then?
So it would be relations between how things can be related to themselves.
Okay, and then this will get into a big, long bit about relationality, but the relationality is key. Now, if we go back again to, and I'm just going to, because I just played the whole clip for you, I dropped the whole clip in here. Now I'm going to just drop in for Clouser again. The key is the incarnation, because in the incarnation, now a degree of relationality is afforded because God brought into himself the creation that he already was the source of.
I think this approach deserves to be called Christian for this reason, that the doctrine of the Incarnation is the only thing that makes the belief in a transcendent creator one that we can actually discuss or speak about. How do our terms apply to God? All our terms are drawn from creatures, from creation. If we call God Father, call God the Judge. God says in Scripture, don't get thinking that the things you use now you own permanently or have some absolute right to. The world's mine, not yours. Okay? We can go on and on and on. How can our terms apply to one who transcends all that, who called all that into existence? How can that be true of him? And the Incarnation, that doctrine rejected by both Jew and Muslim, is the only answer that makes any sense. Is that God takes created things into himself. That's what he did in the Incarnation. He took the whole person of Jesus Christ into himself so that Christ is the human side of God and God is the divine side of Christ. That very idea of taking things that God himself has generated that depend on him into himself so that they are true of himself is how all the other terms got to be true of God as well. They walked and talked with Adam. He said, don't do this. He said, I got angry with this, and
In other words, now it's getting thicker.
You're out of the garden for that. All that can be absolutely true because God takes the created characteristics he has generated into himself and forms the nature this is what Calvin said, the nature in which he is pleased to manifest himself. Now, the whole tradition of theology.
Okay, I've played this before, but it's. I remember being in seminary, and if you'd have to ask me what I knew of orthodoxy when I went through seminary, was one of the things that I took out of seminary. I spent very little time talking about orthodoxy in seminary. It just did not seem germane to what a Christian Reformed minister was going to have to deal with going out somewhere into the world where the Christian Reformed Church was. But the emphasis of the Incarnation, and there's a deep connection between that. This incarnation was so fundamental to the entire story, whereas some people closer to my tradition might think, well, the incarnation, blah, 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 Jesus' ministry, blah, 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 crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, second coming. It's almost the creation, the incarnation was sort of skipped over. It's not skipped over in the Heidelberg Catechism. In fact, when it's not skipped over in the early reformational documents. It's there always, but this emphasis on it that Roy put on, I found that very interesting. And again, it's this move towards the relational. And Roy, where he sort of puts this in, it's very interesting how that sort of lines up with Vervaeke. Okay, now I want to get into sincerity and authenticity. So this, again, I've been getting a lot of this language, and I've been applying it to the Christian Reformed Church and to our culture and to really this massive. I think Tom Holland is right that the 1960s, a few hundred years from now, if the Lord tarries and we survive this age, will be seen as important a time period as the beginning of the 16th century in terms of this groundswell of groundswell of transformation. Of course, transportation was involved too. But this book, You and Your Profile, Identity After Authenticity, Hans-Georg Mueller and Paul J. d.Abrosio. And now the emphasis here tends to be prophilicity, which is completely understandable because this new transhumanist meet Lego culture that we are developing, pro-felicity is sort of the new staging area. But in many ways, a lot of the struggle is between a culture of sincerity and a culture of authenticity. And again, just shorthand before we dive into it, sincerity, generally speaking, is a culture in which you gain status among your peers and in this culture by fulfilling the roles that you inherit, fulfilling traditional gender roles, fulfilling traditional vocational roles, fulfilling different. But notice all of those roles are relational. Authenticity is you gain status by somehow convincing the culture that you are fulfilling some, I often call the secret sacred self, that you are somehow expressing some hidden value and bringing it into existence. All right? Now let's begin the chapter on the culture of sincerity. According to Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook has an ethic of integrity at its core. Now the question is going to be, what kind of integrity? Integrity of authenticity or integrity of sincerity? The Facebook Effect 2010, David Kirkpatrick recounts Zuckerberg's musing on identity, which he seems intending to diffuse the once often heard critique that social media undermines human authenticity by giving users the opportunity to present multiple profiles of themselves. That would be pro-felicity. Authenticity would be that you have one secret sacred self that is in some ways eternal and immutable, and your job as you go through is to express this secret sacred self out into the world, to bring it into realization. But it's fundamentally solitary and potentially solipsistic. And the argument is that Facebook is encouraging pro-felicity where there is no center. You have one identity. So Zuckerberg is fighting against that. You have one identity, he emphasizes 3 times in a single minute during a 2009 interview. He recalls that in Facebook's early days, some argued the service ought to offer adult users both a work profile and a fun social profile. Zuckerberg was opposed to that. The days of you having a different image for your work friends and your coworkers and for the other people you know are probably coming to an end pretty quickly. In other words, don't have those drinking Facebook photos up. I mean, this is very 20 teens again. Facebook is... Many of the people in my church have Facebook profiles and they watch zero YouTube. I'll just say it that way. You better get down those drinking pictures on your Facebook profile because your potential employer might see them. He makes several arguments. Having 2 identities for yourself is an example of a lack of integrity. Zuckerberg says moralistically. He also makes the case he sees as pragmatic. That level of transparency the world now has won't support having 2 identities as a person. Now, this is deeply into church because the church, as I've been mentioning in the Christian Reformed Church, but church has been moving from sincerity to authenticity. Churches value pastors who are transparent. Notice that. Not duplicitous. Now again, you can find psalm after psalm against duplicity. You can find on my channel, if you search back far enough, you can find a eulogy that I made for my father. And what I said about my father was, he was a man of tremendous integrity. He had no guile. There was no duplicity in him. That's a biblical value. That's why I'm saying that sincerity is not good and authenticity bad. There is a degree of opponent processing relationship between them, but they should be understood in this larger context of relationality and being. In other words, even if you want to integrate your personal from your professional information, you won't be able to. So information about you proliferates on the internet and elsewhere. This has proven to be true. We would say the same about any image one seeks to project. For example, a teenager who acts docile at home but is a drug-using reprobate, interesting choice of words, this Calvinist finds, with his friends. Zuckerberg, along with key group of his colleagues, also believes that by openly acknowledging who we are, you could put really in there, not literally, actually maybe who we really are. But remember, real is sort of like tall. Maybe I should find that in the video and play it. Now, for those reductive materialists out there whose YouTube profile might start with a T and a G, you better stay away from this video because Vervaeke goes pretty hard after reductive materialism.
Why are they doing what they're doing? Because they think there's a better explanation. Even if it stays within the domain of, I don't know what to call it, everyday experience.
Well, they could be doing what they're doing because they want to have sex, and ultimately somehow it leads to that.
It has what? Actual causal changes to their ability to interact. Like there's always a crypto measure of how I'm judging that things are real, that I'm getting a better explanation, that I'm getting more control over my environment. I can more reliably achieve the goals I want. But you're always standing back and saying, but how do you know any of that? How do you know that that's the case? Oh, well, because I do this and this and this. And when I don't do that, I might be deceived or it might be mere appearance. But when I do these things, I can have more confidence. As soon as you're making any kind of epistemic choice where you're placing more confidence in one thing rather than another and choosing one thing over another, you have an implicit criterion of realness.
Firstly, I'm not an instrumentalist nor pragmatist. Are you defining real? Do you have a definition of real in your mind that you're...
Real is a comparative term, right? So like it's like...
Yes, so-and-so is more real than something
right.
else.
And also vice versa. If I say that is an error or that's an illusion or that's a delusion, I only can do it in contrast and comparison to something I point at and say, this is not a delusion. This is not an error. This is true. This is how things are. Even the instrumentalists can't believe that the experience of looking at their instruments is fundamentally an illusion. What are they basing their instrumentalism on?
Well, I don't think the instrumentalist would say that what they're doing is even knowledge. They may just say, what are you talking about? What is this talk of real and knowledge? This just happens to happen. This is correlated with so-and-so. I get to work.
Did they know that before they did their practice, that there was a correlation? Are they right about that? Could they be wrong about it? Their claim that they're not making any knowledge claim is duplicitous because, of course, somebody can come along and say, hey, you're actually wrong about that correlation. We did a bigger study. Turns out that correlation isn't there. So they could be wrong, they can be right, and they claim to know something. They claim to know the correlation. They're not getting out of this.
The claim about real being relational, X is real only in relation to Y or more real, is that itself a relational claim?
Yes, exactly. So real is like tall, right? You're always you're drawing, you're making. It's not unintelligible to say that's tall. It's unintelligible to say, imagine a universe in which there's one thing and it's tall.
Okay, well, in this case, it would be like saying so-and-so is taller. Okay, Adam is taller than Sarah.
Right.
But me saying that is taller than so-and-so. Like you saying X is more real than Y. Is there a reality to that statement such that that statement alone can be in comparison to something else?
So what do you mean by reality? Does it really refer does it refer to something that exists independent of the statement? What do you mean?
Okay. If you have that this microphone here is more real than our idea of the microphone. Let's just say that.
Okay.
This microphone here is more real than what we think of as the microphone.
Yes.
Okay. That statement, would you ascribe reality to that statement, to the statement about that you can compare between two objects, some relation that says that they're real, this one's more real than this one? Is that itself subject to that comparison?
Of course it is. Because notice, is this something, do you know that you made that statement? Is that statement connected and does it explain other things that you do? Is it explainable by other beliefs you have? Of course. To the degree to which it unpacks intelligibility, you attribute realness to it.
The trouble is, though, so I'm sure you know naive realism, which says that what's real is independent of our minds.
Sure.
Okay. Automatically, you're saying that doesn't even count as real.
So the problem with the question is it presupposes the substance metaphysics I'm rejecting, right? It's saying that there's things that exist and they exist as they do, completely independent of how we know them. And I don't know what that means. But that
Now, what's really interesting about this was until Kurt Jamungal points out the microphone on the ottoman, I never saw it. We had a case in this is the bouncing ball and the guy in the ape suit experiment. This is this question that they're going to sort of wrestle with for a while, which is the reality of things outside of perception. And it's a difficult question, and it's one I think that a lot of the current stuff going on under the surface now is sort of wrestling with. And so Dogbark was in Estuary, and he made a point about all the flowers that were out and that it was Mother's Day. And I made the point to him that those flowers are actually on that table every weekend. He's never seen them. And this is, again, part of this question of, well, nobody's saying that the mic wasn't there before we noticed it. Nobody's saying that the flowers weren't there before Dogbark noticed them in the Estuary meeting. But this whole substance, the arising of this substance ontology and how this then sort of gets us into relationality. And of course, a lot of Jonathan Pageau's work is deeply under this. This is why we're having the conversations we're having right now. Zuckerberg, along with key groups of his colleagues, also believe that by openly acknowledging who we are and behaving consistently along with our friends, who we really are, this perfect secret sacred self way down here, and behaving consistently according to that's integrity with respect to my authenticity, will help to create a healthier society. Okay, can you tell us more about that healthy society? And he would probably say a whole bunch of things, some of which would be connected with Jesus and some of which would be connected beyond Jesus, etc., etc. Zuckerberg's plea for integrity is the public display of a consistent personality that can hardly escape accusations of hypocrisy. As duplicitous as the teenager in the example, the self-proclaimed connector of the world values openness while simultaneously living a rather reclusive life. He spends $30 million buying up neighborhood houses around his Palo Alto compound just to ensure his privacy. And although boldly suggesting you have one identity, he is known as a bold and ruthless entrepreneur who can be self-assured and even condescending in front of Congress, but also famously shy and unassuming during interviews. He uncomfortably fumbles his way through his own 2018-2019 video series entitled The Future of Technology and Society. Despite his claim that human identity ought to be singular, and if singular, therefore expressed, and in some ways, the secret sacred self thing is not only is my secret sacred self down deep inside of me perfect, but it should express that perfection. So which identity is correct? Who is the real Mark Zuckerberg? Is he simply a hypocrite who asks others to do something he himself cannot do or will not do? Is he a fake, lacking the very integrity of the identity he desires Facebook to enable? Maybe the actual problem is not Mark Zuckerberg himself, but his simplistic philosophical identity and consequently his flawed ethic of integrity. Instead of questioning Zuckerberg's personality, we should challenge his reasoning. Is it actually possible for someone to present the same character across all social settings? Well, integrity sort of asks that for us, and there's definitely a value in that. And we might even see that value in Jesus. Let's say if you're a Christian, you say, okay, well, Jesus is the model. Okay. Of course, people do act differently in different situations. They do not address their boss like they would address a baby. A parent is not treated like a stranger and vice versa. We do not act in a classroom as we would in a ball game or in a church. According to teachers that I talk to these days, many children have never been to church. If you try to engage them in the topic of reverence, many of them have never experienced it at all in their life. And missing that category of reverence, oh, that has implications down the road. Zuckerberg's sweeping claim you have one identity has little to do with historical, sociological, or psychological evidence and is flatly contradicted by social media practices. Identities are fragile and dynamic patchworks. The common and, as in Zuckerberg's case, often unquestioned idea that everyone has a single underlying self that ought to be identified and publicly expressed, it's authenticity, in the form of a coherent individuality in order to have integrity, rose to prominence only rather recently in the modern age of authenticity. The semantics of this age guide the semantics of Facebook's ethos. Prior to this age, however, identity was often understood differently. It was acknowledged that people had to assume numerous roles in society, and thus integrity did not lie in presenting the very same true persona all the time. Rather, it rested in carrying out one's different roles properly and virtuously, as well as in fulfilling commitments to those roles to the extent of truly identifying with them. This was the integrity of sincerity. I am going to, in my realm as family, be a father. In my realm as church, be a pastor. In the realm of YouTube, be a YouTuber or whatever it is I am. The late American Confucian philosopher Henry Rosemont Jr. used the metaphor of peaches and onions to illustrate the difference between viewing people as a core self versus being composed of social roles and relationships. Now, again, some of you listening to this are going to be immediately afraid of fragmentation. Social roles and relationships. Yes, but you don't treat your boss like you treat your baby. Lie down, bucko, I'm changing your diaper. No. People may be seen as peaches, an external skin that is public, the fruit itself, which is our body, as well as our personality and history. And then there is a peach pit, our self, or our secret sacred self, which endures, not change from day to day, and is quite literally the seed of future life, biological and mental. But think instead of an onion. I peel off successive layers, first son, then husband, father, grandfather, mother, maiden, mother, matriarch. There's something that's happening here. Now, there's got to be integrity. It's all still onion. Peeling away the layers of friends, students, teachers, colleagues, neighbors, etc. And what is left is there's no more layers, nothing at all. Now, again, there's going to have Christian implications here. Luke is going to mention his Whitestone name. You were seen from the foundations of the earth. Christians are going to come in with a soul. But then again, even though Christians are still using these terms and working these terms, I'm not in any way saying that these terms are obsolete. But our understanding of these terms has continued to develop. I'll say it that way. Never shy about his predilections, Rosemont pounced on anyone who adopted for a peach view of themselves. If you claim to have a core immutable self, why is it that any description of that self can be readily explained through your social interactions? And of course, this is sort of the irony that you find with teenagers. They're all being individuals in all the same way. And the most amazing thing that I've seen in these current days, where the sort of the reign of the authentic secret sacred self, number one, keeps changing, and Profilicity is just scrambling that. And now we have not so much the pilgrim, but the tourist, or rather the chameleon, who, this is my identity now, this is my identity now, this is my identity now. But then you have the question of what is the thread through them? And they say, well, the secret sacred self. Well, so when you were this thing, were you failing to express that secret sacred self? It's not working very well. And you can very quickly see that, well, we are going to have some opponent processing between these two perspectives of culture and society and identity and integrity. What meaning could your life possibly have outside those roles and relationships? And this, again, is where we start connecting into the non-substance ontology, where it's relationality. And then we're going to have the question of, well, what is holding all of these relationships together? Do we not live our lives as abstract individuals with accidental relationship, but become who we are through bonds with others? We live as fathers, daughters, brothers, teachers, and so forth. We are an aggregate of various dynamic personal connections. When they change, we change. Even a small variant can unsettle us, while big changes can completely alter our identity. A family member dies and our life is transformed. We get married or have children and our world dramatically shifts. Rosemont paraphrases David Hume, replacing perception with role, to make a point. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular role or other of father or son or friend or neighbor or teacher or student. I never catch myself at any time apart from a role, and never can observe anything except the viewpoint of roles. And again, people who go out to find themselves, what are they doing? They have something that they are checking against other things. And that what they're often doing is sort of chameleon-like. Oh, I was a this thing and now I'm a Christian. So, in fact, the Apostle Paul says, basically uses the analogy of putting on Christ as if you're putting on a garment. And so, in fact, there are things that are changing. And the crisis, of course, is, well, if there's no line through, maybe I lose myself. So there's sort of a doubling down on authenticity. The self, person, or I, simply the complex or amalgam of various roles and relationships. This is what sincerity as a method of achieving identity refers to, recognizing that social role encumbrances make encumbrances. It's often because this is where you bump into the real, the more real than you, because now this is people who talk about an objective desk that I have my foot on, an objective lens cap that I have in front of me. With enough velocity, this could kill me. With enough velocity. Right now, not so much. They make us who we are. The position Rosemont advocated is clearly radical. For him, the social roles and relationships did not simply contribute to a sense of oneself or identity. They weren't sort of the varnish on the peach pit. They consisted of it entirely. But now, okay, this is where you're going to bump into, well, you can go back to John Vervaeke talking to Sam about AI, or is there something else that's in us that the machines can't capture? Is there a there beneath it all? And so you can see why ideas of the peach pit arise. He was a leftist communitarian who hoped to achieve social justice and overcome the evils of capitalism by promoting a fundamentally role-based conception of identity, cleansed of its oppressive aspects and adapted to contemporary context. Oh, you mean this disciple of Sincerity was a communist? Yeah, he was. Today, people are likely to disagree with such an extremist conception. Authenticity, with its emphasis on creating or finding one's individual self, has become increasingly important over the past few hundred years. Now, part of that could always be because of the scrambling. Because once all of these other roles are no longer assured by the social context that you're in, people can't even find mates. They're never going to be a father or a mother. So then what are they? Merely an employee, a cog in the capitalist wheel? They want to be authenticity. They want to be Jack Kerouac and go off. They want to be with Huck Finn and light out for the territory. In pre-modern times, the onion of personhood could easily be regarded as convincing. From a somewhat idealized reconstruction of the pre-modern role of Confucianism, Rosemont drew inspiration for his attempt to root out the hyper-individualism he perceived to be a source of most socio-political problems in the modern world. But again, now, of course, he's comparing. He's got some utopian vision or eschatological vision. He's saying, well, we want to get there, so let's get rid of this peach and pit thing, and maybe if people can be onions, we can construct them wholly by the systems. And a whole bunch of you who have developed an allergic reaction to wokeness will be like, well, there it is. I am nothing. I am. And so on one hand, when I've been talking about authenticity and sincerity, you've been like, yes, traditional roles, we inherit them. That's who we really are. But once you sort of say that's who we really are, you're sort of sounding like authenticity with the peach pit. This is tricky stuff. In his seminal Sincerity and Authenticity, Lionel Trilling refused to Hegel to explain the experience of sincere identity in pre-modern times. The historical process that Hegel undertakes to expound is the self-realization of spirit through the changing relation of the individual to the external power of society. In an initial state of the process, that is being described as individual consciousness, is to say, to be a wholly harmonious relation to the external power of society. So in other words, to be sincerity is to render obedient service. Its service is not only obedient, but also silent and unreasoned, taken for granted. Authenticity, you have to achieve your identity. Sincerity, you simply receive it. Now, some of you who've listened to Tim Keller's sermons will say, oh, Christianity, you receive your identity. You have new life in Christ. Language fits well into a culture of sincerity. But is that durable? Well, for Christians, you had a soul, and a soul became this durable thing that you were. Now, of course, if the soul is gone, now suddenly there is no substance, and then are all of these roles accidents? And suddenly you have a meaning crisis. Under conditions of role-based sincerity, identity is achieved by conforming to external powers, as manifested in pre-established relationships, norms, and customs. Identity, value, and moral credit nobility is generated through obedient service in the form of compliance to social expectations and role-based interactions with others. Inner reverence, referred to as a commitment to what aligns one's thoughts and feelings with one's roles, eventually resulting in heroism of dumb service that finds glory in complete role submission. After sort of the nihilism, so you can sort of see that authenticity can be a way out of nihilism, because it's, well, you have your secret sacred self, and that's going to be my guiding star, even though it's internal. I'm going to try and align myself to that secret sacred self. Of course, psychology and sociology come along and say there is no soul. So was the soul the secret sacred self? Not exactly. Now, of course, in Christianity, your life is hidden with Christ in heaven. Now, what does that mean? Well, okay, so now it's perfect obedience service to your Lord. You can go back to Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand. Jordan Peterson keeps talking about covenant, 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 covenant. Well, you're faithful to the covenant. That's who you are. Sincerity was a prime method of achieving identity in pre-modern times, and it still is applied today. For example, in the family, in religious communities, and in sports. In professional contexts, too, role commitment, identification with one's job or position in a group or team is often celebrated. These can found a person's sense of selfhood and become a major source of meaning and significance. In After Virtue, Alistair McIntyre introduced the notion of characters to describe the identification of an individual personality with a social role. His character included, for example, Prussian officer, social democrat, university professor of the 19th and 20th century Germany. They all represented examples of sincerity in an already modern society and demonstrate how this technology of identity has been able to coexist with an emerging age of authenticity. And I would assert that after the meaning crisis, a lot of people are resolving their meaning crisis by pursuing once again a culture of sincerity. I've been authentic, but I've been lonely. My secret sacred self has sort of been trying to catch the snitch. Now, I'm done chasing the snitch. I am going to be a father, be a deacon, be a member of a church, be a husband, be an employee, and I will derive my identity by fulfilling these roles. And in cooperation to the people around me, my wife will celebrate me and I will celebrate her. She will say, you are a faithful husband, and I will say, you are a faithful wife, and we will raise children, and if we do it right, again, okay, back to this whole of alignment in both sacred and divinity, if we do this right, well, how will we get this knowledge? Well, you're probably going to want a thick tradition. Well, how do traditions thicken? When they get older. You can sort of playing itself out all around us. And so this fight in the Christian Reformed Church, which is going on right now, again in the 1970s, well, Archie Bunker is a dinosaur. Well, Archie Bunker is back. Well, you know, he's been polished off. He's not going to say all the racist and sexist things he did then. He's sort of been modified. But the difficulty is that, well, Gloria never quite knew when to wear the swimsuit. And she showed up in the swimsuit in awkward places. And she discovered that just walking around in a swimsuit to find out where she gets praised and where she gets ignored. And then, of course, it's really interesting because would a Hollywood actor show up looking like this? No, he'd have to hit the gym. He'd have to get shredded. He shouldn't just walk on TV looking like, he shouldn't walk on TV with his dad bod when he's not a dad. Here's authenticity. Oh, no, but now we demand profilicity. Is this good for Meathead's career? Is Meathead's body a product of what? Well, my secret sacred self, underneath all of this fat on top, as the little Twitter ads will show, I've got a six-pack. We all do. You just can't see it. Well, what's it covered up by? Well, my secret sacred self is covered up by all of this popsicle that I'm eating and this lack of exercise that I'm doing because Mike is out there becoming a radical because Archie's paying for him to go to college to learn all of these new words that he can throw at Archie. So often when I listen to Jonathan Peugeot talk about what, we've all sort of been participating in the last few years, he talks about these changes. And yeah, these changes are all around us. And they're happening. They're happening around us. We're seeing the evidence of them. We're feeling the impacts of them. But they're happening. And, John keeps saying that in the future, probably the most important, you're going to call it a science? The most important discipline is going to be theology, which is amazing because for the last 100 years, it was pretty much run out of the university. And now the universities are running out of what seems, what should have been grounding them. And a lot of interesting questions are coming about and transformations are happening. So let me know what you think.